I hope I have set the context for passing parameters in URLs or APIs. But just a recap, we have been using this particular API or URL to execute the get product function. And what happens is that we use this URL to get the list of all the products which are there in the file. Now let's say we want to find out the details of individual products for a particular product ID. For that, we have to add the product ID as a variable or as an argument or as a parameter rather in the URL. Now here the product underscore ID is not a text, it is actually the value of the product ID that we are going to pass. And what would happen is that to capture the value of this product underscore ID, we'll have to modify the parameters after route something like this. So we'll have the get product as it is, but after that we'll use this angular bracket and then use the product underscore ID variable. And it has to be passed in the function just like we pass any other argument in a function. And then the logic would continue. So this is one variable or one parameter. What if we want to pass multiple values? Let's say I want to find out the information for a product ID and a customer. And in that case, the URL would be something like this. The URL might be a little confusing. Let me change it. And this is what I meant. We'll be passing the actual value of the product ID and the customer ID. Now, as we are passing values for two parameters, we'll have to capture these two parameters in the app.route and we'll do it something like this. So after the API, we'll have the product ID and the customer ID or CID. And as usual, we'll have to pass these arguments in the function also, just like we pass arguments in functions. This is how we capture parameter and its values using the Flask class itself. And this feature is provided by the framework. Just pass the value of the parameter and capture it in a variable in the Python program. There might be scenarios that you want to pass integer, but instead of that, someone has passed a, let's say, string value. So let's say you are expecting 1, 2, 3, but you got ABC. Now in that case, what would happen? The program would unnecessarily fail and it will throw type error. To fix that, there's something called parameter enforcement, and we can enforce the parameter types using these different variable values. We can enforce a string, integer, float, path, and UUID. The way we do it is something like this. We still have the app.route and the API endpoint. And here we mentioned that the product ID has to be integer and the customer ID also has to be integer. Or in the second case, product ID has to be integer and price has to be decimal. So if someone sends, let's say, string value instead of decimal, then the error would be thrown in the URL itself or in the browser or to the program which is calling this API. There are a few other things that I want to talk about. The first thing is, what if we use slash at the end? How Flask would interpret the slash at the end of a particular URL. What if we run or what if we create same function for multiple URLs? So what would happen is that we want to execute the same function irrespective of the URL that we send. Let's say there are 6 URLs and all of them should go to the same function. All of them should execute the same function. How do you do that? Then there's one more consideration. What if we create multiple functions for the same URL? How Flask could behave? So these are the things that cannot be talked theoretically. We'll have to see it in hands-on. And this is what the hands-on would be on the passing of parameters. So we have Postman and we'll use Postman to send request to different APIs. We have already used list product and list price quantity. I'll be creating a new Flask application. And what will I do here is that I will create an API, get product detail. Okay. And first I'll show you using multiple parameters. So I'll pass one parameter, then I'll pass two parameters. Let's say the first parameter would be the product ID and the second parameter would be what do you want to see of that particular product, whether it is price or stock quantity or something else. I will show you using both data type enforcement and without it. In the second hands-on, I will show you how the addition of slash at the end or at the trailing end of an URL changes the behavior. So I'll create a program to handle both of these and see both the scenarios. After that, in the same program, what will I do is that I will create multiple URLs and I would make sure that all these URLs call the same program. Now here I was passing product ID along with the value that you want, but what will I do is that I will have different URLs for different values. What I mean by that, we have product ID, the name of the product or the company of the product, then category ID, price, items, SKU, etc., supplier, and creation date. So let's say someone wants only the price, someone wants only the inventory or how many units are there, someone wants the supplier information of that particular product. For all of those different requests, we'll use different URLs or APIs. So these are basically the column of the same row. So I'll pass the column ID or the column name rather, and then we'll get the information of that particular column. I know this is not something that you would do in using API. Typically it would be in a table and then we'll get the table and then select the column whichever is needed. But to show you how to run a single program for multiple URLs, I'll use this because you have been using the product dataset for some time now. Then I'll talk about the second consideration. What if we have the same URL, but we have two different functions mapped to the same URL? What would happen? If you remember, I talked about the hash map table in Flask. So Flask creates kind of an hash map table which would contain the name of the API, the function name, and the position of the function in the program. So whenever it sees that, okay, this is the API, then it would go ahead and execute the function. But now what would happen is that for the same API list product, we have two different functions, get amount 1 and get amount 2. So the name is wrong here. It should be get amount 1 and get amount 2. So both the functions are pointing to the same API or the same URL. How Flask could behave in such cases. So I'll cover all these in the coding part itself. So let's open PyCharm and start coding. The first one would be to pass a single parameter and get the information. Let me create a new program in the same folder, API using Python Flask. And as you can see, I have a few more files and we'll be using these files in the future hands-on and your projects also. And don't worry about the codes. I'll provide all the codes and all the files in the resources section or maybe in my GitHub repository. So let me go ahead and create a new Python file. And the name of the file would be API parms, or rather Flask API parms. And this is the boilerplate code that I have just copied and pasted. Now what am I going to do is that I have the same retail product data file, and these are the 8 products that we have. I'll be creating a program and I'll be passing only one parameter, which will be the product ID. If I pass the product ID, I should get the entire line and send it back as a response. So essentially, I'm trying to get the details of a product. So that's why the API would just get the product ID, read the file, and send the product details, which is essentially the entire line. I've copied the same code from the previous program, which is product API from file. I'll change the name of the function. It'll be product detail. I'm opening the file, reading the lines, and I have to remove these things. Now what will I do is that for each line, I'll have to match the product ID with the product ID in the file. That's what I'll be doing, right? To get the individual product. So first I'll get the product ID in the file. So file product ID should be the first element after splitting the line, right? So once we split the line using comma, we'll get an array. And the first element is the product ID in the file itself. Then I will match the file product ID with the product ID that I'm getting from the parameter. I have not defined it yet, so that's why I'm getting the error. If this is the case, if it matches, then it's fine. Let's say data equal to the entire line, which is I, and then I'll return I here. In JSON or in array does not matter, I'm returning the entire line, right? So this is what the program would do. Now there are a few things. Now before going further, I want to tell you that it is going to scan the entire file and then it will match each and every record. So that's why I said at the beginning of this hands-on that we should not use files. This is not a good practice. We should use databases, relational, NoSQL, or in-memory, or any other databases for that matter. We'll do that in our next hands-on anyway. So now it is done. So this code is done. There are a few things which are pending. The first thing is the naming the API itself. So the name of the API would be product detail, and I'll have to pass a parameter which would be product ID. Now when you pass parameter, it would be in angular brackets, and let's name it as product ID itself so that it is not confusing. Now what Flask framework would do, it would go ahead and capture the product ID, value of the product ID, and then it will try to pass it in the function. In the function, we'll have to capture the variable using an argument, but we have not provided any argument. So that's why this product ID is not defined. So I'll need to get this product ID from the function argument. And that's what I'm going to do. So the product ID would be passed using the product ID variable name itself. And that's what we are matching. Now, why you have product ID everywhere? So that there is no confusion. I could have named it as PID also. It wouldn't have mattered because PID, now in that case, we'll have to pass PID, and then product ID should be equal to PID. So anything is fine as long as you are passing the variable. So let me recap what I have done. I have the same app.route. I have the same API name, product detail. Again, I mean, it's not the same name. It is a new API, but the format is same. But this time I have an additional stuff, which is the extension of the API. But this is not part of the API because it is in angular brackets. If I remove the angular brackets, then it would be part of the API. We'll see these complex APIs later on, but as of now, this is a variable which is getting captured. So I'm saying Flask that the API request would send a value, capture that value in PID and pass it in the function using an argument. And the name of the argument is obviously PID. This is a name, this is the name of the variable, and the same variable has to be passed. And I'm capturing the PID in product ID. And then I am opening the file and I'm reading the lines. And item and dictionary, these are not needed anymore. So for each line or for each record in the file, I'm matching the first element, which is the product ID, with the argument that have been passed. So now if it matches, then we'll return I. If it does not match, I'll have to mention an else also. I should be product not found. This is what that I will pass. All right. Return has to be there obviously. And now let's run the Flask program using the host 0000 and the port would be 8000, and by default I'll use debug mode to be true. We are not deploying it in production, so we can keep the debug mode as true. So let's start this, and the program has started. Now let's go to Postman, and this is the server URL 127.0.0.1.8000, and the API is product detail. First, let's execute the API without passing any value. It says that not found. It gives you 404 error. But this time, let's pass a value. So let's pass 4278. The problem is that I was running a different program, test Flask, not this particular program. So let me right click and execute using run Flask API params. Now it is getting executed in port number 9000. Maybe I'll change it to 8000 and then execute it again. All right, now Flask API params is getting executed on port number 8000. Okay, so let's try it out. I'm using the URL 127.0.0.1, port number 8000, then the API, which is product detail, and I'm passing the product ID. And let's see what output do I get. Okay, it is saying product not found. Is that the case? But 4278 is the first product in the file. So seems like there's some problem in the program. So let's try to understand what is happening, but I don't think we'll have to debug the program. What is happening here is that for each line, I'm getting the file product ID after splitting the line with comma. So file product ID is a string and it is matching with product ID, which is actually PID that we are getting from the URL. And one thing here is that even if it matches, the for loop would continue. Eventually it would go to the last record, which is actually not matching, and it will show product not found, and that is what is happening here. So what we have to do here is that once it matches, we have to make sure that it comes out of the for loop. I'm introducing a new term called break. So break statement would come out of the for loop. So once it comes out, the entire record would be in the data variable and then it will return data. So let's see whether it works now or not. And as you can see, we get the output. The entire line has been printed here, which is in HTML format. If we change it to JSON, this is how it would look like. Obviously not a good way to see the value. So the entire line has come. Now let's use another product ID. Let's say 4560, and which is Eco Global Logistics. So which is Eco Global Logistics, and it is working. Let's try 4753, and it is Mastech, and this is also working. So by passing a single value, you are able to get the information. So this is how we pass parameters and capture the parameter in app.route using this Angular bracket and then use it later on in our function. So essentially the API is using the parameter to return the output. Now what we'll do is that we'll make some changes and I'll add one more parameter. The requirement is as such that we are getting the entire line and it is not a good way to look at a particular record, but we do not want everything. So you want a particular column and we'll pass what column do I need in the API itself. For example, let's say I want price, I'll type price. Let's say I want quantity, I'll type quantity. And then the API should capture that value and use that value to do the processing or the business logic. What I do is that I'll add one more variable. I'm using the same API to do the same. And here the name would be column, right? And of course, the column has to be captured here. The column has to be passed as an argument. Now, I'll have to change the logic a little bit. First of all, we'll have to check whether the product ID matches or not. If it matches, which is this one, then I'll have to check what does the user want. So I'll put an if logic on column, and if column is something, then what I have to do is that I'll have to pass the value, right? So I'll remove this one and I will add data as a dictionary, as an empty dictionary rather. And now data product ID would be the product ID, which would be file product ID. And then if the column is, let's say, price, then we'll add price here, and price is the third element. If column equal to QTY, which is actually quantity, then I'll pass the product ID and the quantity of that product, which is the fifth element. And along with it, let's pass the price also, all right? And finally, else, if nothing matches, then I will send a message saying that please provide a valid column, price or quantity. And if nothing matches, I'll send the data as product not found. Now let's execute this. I'll use the same 4753, and if I just enter 4753, it is giving me error now because it says the requested URL was not found. So what will I do? I'll type price here. It says that the price is 524.1 and product ID is 4753. It also passes a message saying that product not found. We'll see, we'll debug this, but at least 4753 is showing, which is 524.1. Let's see whether it is correct or not. 4753 has price 524.1. Let's use 4465, whose price is 825.52. And it should be price 825.52, which is working. And then the product ID, which is 4465. It also says message product not found. And the problem is that I'll have to initialize the dictionary every time. Otherwise, it is getting appended. right? So let's send it now. It has worked now. So only price and product ID. Let's send a product ID 1465. Now it says product not found. And this is how we pass multiple variables also. One more thing that we have not done yet is that we have not enforced the data type. Correct. So let's do that. What will I do is that I will mention the PID to be integer. This is how we enforce the data type, and the column would be string. Okay. So I have made the changes. Nothing else has to be done. Now in product ID, what will I do is I'll pass 1B65. So it is giving you error that product not, 404 URL not found. So this is the problem, which is correct because 1B65 is not a correct product ID. And let's send a correct product ID, which is 4950, but instead of price, let's say 123. It can be considered as string, so that's why it is showing product not found. But here, if we use, let's say, string, then it will give you error that 404 not found. Let's remove the enforcement and see what happens with the same API. I'll remove integer here and I'll remove column. And now what it would show, it would show my product not found because it is a string and it has been captured as a string. The PID is actually a string and which is not matching, right? So that's why it's always better to enforce the data type of the parameters that you are passing. This concludes the first part of the second hands-on, which is to pass one parameter first and then two parameters with and without data type enforcement. Now you know what data type enforcement does. Now you know how to pass parameters using the Flask class. Okay, now the next thing that we are going to do is we'll see, is there any difference between /price and /price/. So we'll work with both API and parameter and let's see how it behaves.